was April 22nd in the year 1915 that German forces shocked Allied soldiers along the Western Front by firing more than 150 tons of lethal chlorine gas against two French colonial divisions at Ypres, Belgium. This was the first major gas attack by the Germans, and it devastated the Allied line. Toxic smoke has been used occasionally in warfare since ancient times, and in 1912 the French used small amounts of tear gas in police operations. At the outbreak of World War I, the Germans began actively to develop chemical weapons. In October of 1914, the Germans placed some small tear gas canisters in shells that were fired at Neuve-Chapelle, France. But Allied troops were not exposed. In January of 1915, the Germans fired shells loaded with xylobromide, a more lethal gas. This gas was used on Russian troops at Bolimov on the Eastern Front. Because of the wintry cold, most of the gas froze. But the Russians nonetheless reported more than 1,000 continued of eternity as a result of the new weapon. On April 22nd in 1915, the Germans launched their first and only offensive of the year, known as the Second Battle of Ypres. The offensive began with the usual artillery bombardment of the enemy lines. When the shelling died down, the Allied defenders waited for the first wave of German attack troops, but instead were thrown into panic when chlorine gas wafted across no man's land and down into the trenches. The Germans targeted 4 miles of the front with the wind-blown gas, poison gas, and decimated 2 divisions of French and Algerian colonial troops. The Allied line was breached, but the Germans, perhaps as shocked as the Allies by the devastating effects of the poison gas, failed to take full advantage, and the Allied held most of their positions. A second gas attack against a Canadian division on April 24th pushed the Allies further back, and by May they had retreated to the town of Ypres. The Second Battle of Ypres ended on May 25th with insignificant gains for the Germans. The introduction of poison gas, however, would have great significance in World War I. Immediately after the German gas attack at Ypres, France and Britain began developing their own chemical weapons and gas masks, with the Germans taking the lead in an extensive number of projectiles filled with deadly substances polluted the trenches of World War I. Mustard gas, introduced by the Germans in 1917, blistered the skin, eyes, and lungs, and continued the eternity of thousands. Military strategists defended the use of poison gas by saying it reduced the enemy's ability to respond and thus save lives in offenses. In reality, defenses against poison gas usually kept pace with offensive developments, and both sides employed sophisticated gas masks and protective clothing that essentially negated the strategic importance of chemical weapons. The U.S., which entered World War I in 1917, also developed and used chemical weapons. Future President, our nation's 33rd President, Harry S. Truman, was the captain of a U.S. field artillery unit that fired poison gas against the Germans in 1918. In all, more than 100,000 tons of chemical weapons agents were used in World War I. Some 500,000 troops were injured and almost 30,000 continued their eternity, including 2,000 Americans. In the years following the Great War, Britain, France, and Spain used chemical weapons in various colonial struggles, despite mounting international criticism of chemical warfare. In 1925, the Geneva Protocol of 1925 banned the use of chemical weapons in war, but did not outlaw their development or stockpiling. Most major powers built up substantial chemical weapon reserves. In the 1930s, Italy employed chemical weapons against Ethiopia, and Japan used them against China. In World War II, chemical warfare did not occur, primarily because all the major belligerents possessed both chemical weapons and the defenses, such as gas masks, protective clothing, and detectors that rendered them ineffectual. In addition, in a war characterized by lightning-fast military movement, strategists opposed the use of anything that would delay operations. Germany, however, did use poison gas to continue the eternity of millions in its extermination camps. Since World War II, chemical weapons have only been used in a handful of conflicts. The Yemeni conflict of 1966-67, the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 through 88, and always against forces that lacked gas masks or other simple defenses. In 1990, our nation and the Soviet Union signed an agreement to cut their chemical weapons arsenal by 80% in an effort to discourage smaller nations from stockpiling the weapons. In 1993, an international treaty was signed banning the production, stockpiling after 2007, and use of chemical weapons. It took effect in 1997. It was April 22nd in the year 1970 that Earth Day, an event to increase public awareness of the world's environmental problems, is celebrated in our nation for the first time. Millions of Americans, including students from thousands of colleges and universities, participated in rallies, marches, and educational programs across the country. Earth Day was the brainchild of Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, a staunch environmentalist who hoped to provide unity to the grassroots environmental movement and increase ecological awareness. The objective was to get a nationwide demonstration of concern for the environment so large that it would shake the political establishment out of its lethargy. Senator Nelson said, and finally force this issue permanently onto the national political agenda. The 1962 publication of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, about the effects of pesticides, is often cited as the beginning of the modern environmental movement in the U.S.'s sustainability, organic eating, and the Back to the Land movement that continued to gain steam throughout the 1960s. The first Earth Day indeed increased environmental awareness in America, and in July of 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency was established by special executive order to regulate and enforce national pollution legislation. Earth Day also led to the passage of the Clean Water and Endangered Species Acts. On April 22nd in 1990, the 20th anniversary of Earth Day, more than 200 million people in 141 countries participated in Earth Day celebrations. Senator Nelson was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by our nation's 42nd president, President Clinton. He continued his eternity in 2005. Earth Day has been celebrated on different days by different groups internationally. The United Nations officially celebrates it on the vernal equinox, which usually occurs about March 21st. Earth Day 2021, the 51st anniversary, is celebrated on April 22nd. This year, in 2022, it'll be on a Friday, April 22nd. Happy Earth Day. It was April 22nd in the year 1992 that dozens of sewer explosions in Guadalajara, Mexico, continued the eternity of more than 200 people and damaged 1,000 buildings. The series of explosions was caused by a gas leak, the warning signs of which were ignored by the Mexican government and the National Oil Company. 3 days prior to the explosions, the residents of a working-class neighborhood in Guadalajara noticed a foul smell in the air. The people experienced stinging in their eyes and throats. Some felt nauseous. Despite complaints, the local authorities did not seriously investigate the issue. On April 22nd at about 11:30 a.m., a series of powerful explosions began. They took place in an area about 1 mile long and seemed to come from 35 feet below the ground along the sewer system. 20 square blocks of Guadalajara were leveled or seriously damaged. In two places, craters nearly 300 feet deep opened up, swallowing the surrounding buildings, roads, cars, and buses. Children home for Easter break were a substantial portion of the casualties. It took a week to find and record the injuries and continuances of eternities. About 1,500 people were hospitalized and 25,000 people had to be evacuated. A subsequent investigation found that a leaky water pipe had caused a gas pipeline below it to rust. The gas then leaked into a sewer line where it set off the powerful blast. Mayor Enrique da Flores was indicted for ignoring the warnings. He subsequently resigned from office. 8 others in the government and Pemex, the National Oil Company, were also charged in the case. Pemex was still reeling from a 1984 Mexico City propane explosion that continued the eternity of 450 people, for which they had also been found responsible. The case brought to light a continuing problem in Mexico: the contamination of sewage by industrial waste and hazardous chemicals, and its effect on the underground piping system. The historic information divulged on this audio file can be verified on History.com.